On my grandchildren's birthday, my own daughter pointed at me and said, in front of everyone, "This old man has no voice here anymore." Before I tell you what happened after that night and how Emily found out in the harshest way possible that you can't silence a father like that, comment below where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe, because every story like this proves that sometimes silence is the loudest answer. The whole room froze. The laughter that had filled the air a moment before died instantly, as if someone had pulled an invisible cord. I stood there, motionless, my chest heavy, trying to hide the shame burning inside me. Jacob gripped a blue balloon in his small hands, not understanding what was happening. Sophie bit her lip, staring at me with those wide, confused eyes. Watching my grandchildren witness that moment was the hardest part. Emily didn't stop. She raised her champagne glass, laughed, and added, "Let's leave the old stories behind. This party is for the young." People laughed, but they were nervous, awkward laughs. I saw a woman fidget with her necklace, avoiding my eyes. A man coughed, glanced at the floor, and took a hurried sip of wine. No one dared to speak. My son-in-law, David, however, smiled with satisfaction. He always enjoyed seeing me diminished, and that night he got the show he wanted. I swallowed hard. The collar of my shirt suddenly felt tight around my neck. Inside me, a storm raged. Shame, anger, sadness. But also something else. A strange calm, sharp as a blade. Emily believed she had silenced me, but what she didn't know was that I had already prepared the greatest answer of my life. I looked at Jacob and Sophie again. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their eyes carried the same question I was asking myself. Why is Mom treating Grandpa like this? In that instant, I made myself a promise. If my daughter had chosen to humiliate me in front of my grandchildren, it would also be in front of them that the truth would one day come out. And when that moment arrived, no champagne glass, no forced laughter would be enough to erase my words. Charleston has always been a beautiful city. Colonial houses painted in soft pastels, narrow cobblestone streets, and the salty ocean air mixed with the sweet scent of magnolias blooming in the gardens. I was born and raised here. And even after so many decades, I never got used to the contrast between the rough simplicity of my calloused hands and the fake shine that had taken over certain homes. My daughter, Emily, was the perfect portrait of that transformation. She lived in a modern mansion, all straight lines and glass walls, almost like a showroom of excess. Every detail seemed calculated to impress, from the Persian rug spread across the hall to the silver cutlery that was barely ever used. I remembered when she was little, running barefoot through my workshop, begging to sand pieces of wood just to imitate me. The smell of sawdust was part of her childhood. But now, in her house, that scent had been replaced by imported perfumes and expensive wines. David, my son-in-law, was the perfect host for that stage. A well-known lawyer, always in custom-tailored suits, flashing that rehearsed smile that barely hid his arrogance. He looked at me the way one looks at an old piece of furniture, outdated, worn, ready to be thrown out. Emily seemed to have inherited that gaze. The little girl who once held my hand with trust now spoke to me as if I were a burden she had to carry. She didn't see her father anymore. She saw only a man too simple to fit into her world. The grandchildren, Jacob and Sophie, were the only part of that picture that still gave me light. Jacob, at 10, had a curiosity that reminded me of my own childhood. He loved taking toys apart to see how they worked and often asked me for help. Sophie, at 8, had a rare sensitivity. She observed everything in silence, her eyes holding more than her words ever revealed. They were the reason I endured being in that house, because at every party, every gathering, I was reminded how out of place I truly was. Family get-togethers in Charleston had changed. They used to be simple backyard barbecues, neighbors gathered around a fire, children running barefoot across the grass. Now, everything revolved around appearances. Emily hired expensive caterers, decorators, musicians. The garden of her mansion looked like the set of a magazine photo shoot. Flawless but lifeless. Everything was perfect and empty. At that birthday party, for example, the table was covered with imported candies. So perfectly decorated they looked more like display pieces than food. The cake had 3 tiers, topped with sugar flowers. Waiters walked around offering glasses of French champagne. And me? I sat quietly in a corner, holding a glass of juice, trying not to look as out of place as I felt. The conversations around me were always the same. Business, trips, investments, worlds that weren't mine. Every time I tried to chime in, I felt the glances, sharp and dismissive, as if my presence broke the harmony of their social theater. But I wasn't an intruder. I was the foundation. The problem was, no one seemed to remember that anymore. George Miller. That was my name. I had built furniture that filled dozens of homes in that very city. Many of the people standing in that room that night had once sat at tables I designed, kept clothes and wardrobes I built, prayed in church pews that came from my shop. My work was everywhere, but I had become invisible. To Emily and David, my story had no value. They saw only an old man, dressed too simply to match the crystal chandeliers above. And maybe, deep down, they were right. I didn't belong there. But what they never understood is that crystal, no matter how shiny, is fragile. One crack and it shatters. Wood, on the other hand, carries the strength of years. It resists time. That's what I was. In that room, bright with too many lights, I felt my shadow shrink. But at the same time, part of me stood strong, like the oak I had shaped with my own hands. I looked at Emily and saw someone who had turned her back on the name she inherited. And I looked at Jacob and Sophie and saw the chance to replant what she was trying to uproot. It was in that contrast, between the luxury that rejected me and the blood that still tied me, that I understood. The stage might be theirs, but the story was still mine, and sooner or later, they would learn that. The hardest way. When I look at my hands, I still see the marks. Tiny scars, old cuts, rough skin that no ointment could ever smooth out. Every line carries a story Emily would rather forget. I started working young, still a teenager, in my father's small carpentry shop. The smell of sawdust and varnish was my constant companion, clinging to my clothes, filling my lungs, becoming part of me. When he fell ill, I took over the shop. I worked day and night, often skipping meals, just to keep alive what kept our family afloat. It was with that same effort that I raised my daughter. While Emily was growing up, I spent countless nights finishing custom furniture. Tables that gleamed under the varnish, chairs that slid smoothly at the touch, cabinets built to last a lifetime. I never turned down work. Never. There was one night I'll never forget. I had to deliver a dining table to a family in Charleston who were about to host an important dinner. The rain was pouring as if the sky itself had collapsed. The street was flooded, but I loaded the piece by myself into the old truck, covering it with a tarp, driving slowly so the finish wouldn't be ruined. By the time I arrived, I was soaked to the bone, shivering from the cold. But when I saw that table shining in the center of their dining room, with everyone praising it, I felt it was worth it. Emily was with me that day. She must have been around 9 years old. She held my hand and whispered, "Dad, someday I want a house like this." I smiled at her, exhausted, but certain. "You will, sweetheart, and it'll be with the sweat of these hands." And I kept that promise. Every dollar I saved, every debt I paid, every night of sleep I sacrificed was so Emily could have the life she dreamed of. I put her in the best schools, even when it meant cutting from my own meals. I worked double shifts to pay for the law school she said she wanted, until the day she decided she'd rather follow another path. It didn't matter. What mattered was seeing her safe, living better than I ever did. When she met David, I thought it was a blessing. He came from a traditional family, had a promising career, knew how to present himself in any room. I thought my daughter had finally found someone who would take care of her. But with time, I realized that along with the status came something else: contempt. David looked at me as if I were just an old carpenter, never as the man who laid every stone on the road they now walked. And Emily started to look at me the same way. Little by little, my work became just the past. The stories I told were labeled as old tailies, and the workshop that had once been her favorite place turned into nothing but a dusty corner she avoided. But the city didn't forget. Many people in Charleston still remembered Miller Woodworks. There were restaurant tables, store counters, even church pews carrying my name. Businessmen who now shook hands with David had once shaken mine with respect when my craft had served them well. The problem was, inside my own house, inside my own family, I had become invisible. And maybe that was the deepest wound, realizing that the recognition I still received from strangers no longer existed in my own daughter's eyes. I remember one dinner in particular, overhearing Emily tell a friend, "My dad has always been a simple man. He never dreamed of anything big." I stayed quiet, but inside, I screamed. I never dreamed for myself. I dreamed for her. That was the part she never understood. Now, sitting in silence in that mansion, staring at every carefully chosen, expensive detail, I could only think, none of this would exist without me. Every trip, every party, every crystal glass. All of it had its roots in the years of sacrifice of a man who never asked for anything in return. But now, seeing Emily treat me like dead weight, I realized words would no longer make her remember. She had chosen to forget, and if she chose to erase the memory of these hands, I would find another way to carve, forever, the value of the name she carried. The living room was packed. Golden lights reflected on glasses. Soft music floated through every corner of the mansion. Children ran through the garden lit with small lanterns, and the adults clustered in groups, laughing loud, swapping stories of trips and business deals. I was seated in an armchair in the corner, watching it all in silence. My presence felt like an afterthought, almost an unwanted piece of furniture in the perfect scene Emily and David had staged. To most of the guests, I was nothing more than her old father, nothing else. But inside me, there was a simple desire growing, to say a few words. It was Jacob and Sophie's birthday, and I wanted to share a piece of Emily's childhood with them, to remind them that family love isn't built on fancy parties, but on memories that last. I waited for the right moment. When the music quieted and everyone gathered around the table, I stepped forward. My voice was calm but steady. "Before we sing happy birthday, I'd like to tell a short story." A few heads turned toward me. I saw a mix of surprise and impatience. Emily, standing beside David, held her champagne glass delicately, her face flawless under layers of makeup. She narrowed her eyes as if my very presence there annoyed her. Still, I continued. "I looked at Jacob and Sophie and smiled. When your mother was your age, she used to run around my workshop. The smell of wood and varnish would cling to her hair. One day she picked up a piece of scrap wood and said, 'Dad, make me a little house.' I stayed up the whole night cutting and sanding until I turned that rough block into something she could call her home." Sophie's eyes lit up. Jacob leaned forward, curious. For a moment, I felt they were with me, connected to the story. But I didn't get the chance to finish. Emily stepped forward, raising her hand as if cutting the air in two. Her voice rang sharp, dripping with disdain. "Dad, enough. Nobody needs to hear those old stories right now." The silence that followed was brutal. Guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman cleared her throat to cover the awkwardness. A man fiddled with his phone, seeking refuge in the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, desperate to break free. But Emily, I tried to speak softly. She cut me off, the cold smile frozen on her lips. "You had your time. Now, it's for the kids? For the young ones." And then she laughed, a laugh that echoed through the room like a sentence passed. David, standing beside her, lifted his glass and added, with cruel irony, "Let's toast to the future, not the past." The guests, unsure of what to do, raised their glasses. Some gave awkward chuckles, others simply mimicked the gesture so they wouldn't stand out. And there, in front of my grandchildren, I was silenced, reduced to nothing. I looked at Jacob and Sophie. They stood frozen, watching me with the wounded innocence of children who couldn't understand why a grandfather should be treated that way. Sophie tugged at her dress sleeve, restless. Jacob furrowed his brow as if wanting to protest, but stayed quiet. The pain wasn't in Emily's words. It was in the looks, the way the guests averted their eyes, the way my grandchildren absorbed every second of that moment. I drew in a deep breath. I didn't answer. I swallowed hard, adjusted the collar of my plain shirt, and stepped back, letting the party go on without me. Inside I felt broken, but also something shifted that very moment. While people toasted, while the music resumed and Emily smiled as if she had won, I realized there was no point in trying to be heard in that room anymore. The time for words was over. Now it was time for action. In that silence, a decision was born, one that would forever change the destiny of the name she carried. After that party, nothing was ever the same again. Not that there had been true respect before, but from that night on, the humiliation stopped being discreet. Emily began to cut me down in little gestures, in sharp remarks, as if she had discovered some twisted pleasure in belittling me. It was as if, by silencing me in front of everyone, she had realized she could silence me whenever she wanted. It started small. I remember one afternoon when I knocked on her door with a gift for the kids, a little wooden horse I had carved myself. Jacob lit up with excitement. He ran around the living room, playing, while Sophie hugged the toy as if it were treasure. Emily just sighed. "Dad, you don't need to bring these old things. They have real toys. Real toys." Those words echoed in my head. What I made with my own hands wasn't real to her. To her, it was junk. Another time, during a family dinner, a guest admired the table in the living room. "What a beautiful piece. It almost looks handmade." David smiled and replied, "We had it shipped from Italy. Cost a fortune, but worth every penny." I swallowed hard. That table had been made by me. I had sanded every curve, polished every detail. But in my son-in-law's mouth, it became an expensive Italian import, because admitting his father-in-law had built it didn't have enough status. And Emily didn't correct him. On the contrary, she nodded in agreement. It hurt. Every lie, every omission was like a new cut reopening old scars. Then came the episode with social media. One day, out of curiosity, I looked up Emily's profile. The name Miller was gone. In its place, shining proudly, was only Emily Anderson. As if erasing my name was the key to being fully accepted in her husband's social circles. I stared at that cold screen, feeling a hollow open in my chest. It wasn't just a last name. It was our family's history. It was the name of my father, of my grandfather, the sweat of generations. And she had ripped it away as if it were disposable. When I tried to talk to her answer cut like a knife. "Dad, you don't understand. The Anderson name opens doors. Miller. No one takes it seriously anymore. No one takes it seriously anymore." Those words haunted me for nights. The small humiliations kept coming. If I arrived at a family gathering in simple clothes, she whispered to her friends. My dad never knew how to dress for special occasions. If I spoke about the past, she interrupted. "Those stories just make us look provincial." And always the same. Smirks, sighed, glances, awkward silences. The worst part was Jacob and Sophie hearing it all. They still sought me out, still ran to hug me when I arrived, but I could see the doubt in their eyes, as if they couldn't understand why their mother treated me that way. I never wanted to drag the children into it, never, but it was impossible to pretend they didn't see. And in the middle of it all, there was David. He didn't even need to raise his voice. A single look was enough. Whenever I tried to get closer, he'd cut across me with that smug smile, the smile of a man convinced he had already won. "You really should rest more, George," he said once at dinner. "The world moves too fast these days for someone who's lived as long as you have." I smiled back, but inside my blood boiled. What he meant was clear. I was outdated. Dead weight. The wounds kept piling up. And I, in silence, collected each one. Because deep down, I knew nothing is more dangerous than a man humiliated too many times for too long. By then, I no longer thought about arguing. I didn't want to prove my worth with words anymore. Emily wouldn't listen. David wouldn't allow it, and the guests would never take my side. But what they all forgot was this. I still had something they could never buy in Italian shops, nor erase with a social media update. I still had the power of choice, and the inheritance of a name cannot be measured in crystal glasses. Every little injustice, every joke, every complicit silence from others, all of it was pushing me toward a decision that would change not only their lives, but the fate of the very name Emily tried so hard to erase. And sooner or later, Emily would learn that even silence can become a sentence. After each humiliation, I taught myself to stay quiet, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Emily and David believed silence meant defeat. They didn't know it was just the time I needed to prepare my response. Nights in Charleston grew long. I sat alone on the porch of my modest house, watching the trees sway in the backyard, holding a cup of cold coffee. In that darkness, the city's noise disappeared, and I could finally think. Think about what I had built. Think about what I still had the power to decide. It was on one of those nights that I pulled out an old wooden box from the closet. Inside it were documents, photographs, and at the bottom, the weathered sign from the workshop that once supported the entire family, Miller Woodworks. Since 1968, I ran my fingers over the faded letters. The wood was scratched, but solid, just like me. That was the proof the Miller name carried weight. It didn't need mansions or foreign surnames to matter. The next morning, I went to see the only man who had always respected my story, Attorney Harris. He welcomed me into his small office, crowded with leather-bound books, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and leather. Harris was discreet but firm. "George, what exactly do you want to change in the will?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. I looked at him without hesitation. "I want the Miller name not to pass on with Emily. She gave it up. So let it stay with the ones who still honor it, Jacob and Sophie." He stared at me for a moment, surprised. "Are you sure? That's a serious decision." I drew in a deep breath. "Harris, my estate isn't just the house or the money in the bank. It's the dignity of a name. And if my daughter chose to bury it, then my grandchildren will be the ones to raise it again." We signed the papers in silence. Each stroke of the pen felt like a hammer striking down on everything Emily had taken from me. I walked out of that office with a strange relief, as if I had left a heavy burden behind. For the first time in a long while, I felt I had regained control of my own story, but I told no one. I returned home, placed the documents back in the wooden box, and hid it beneath the floorboards where no one but me would know. At every new party where Emily mocked me, I thought of those signed pages. She believed she was diminishing me. What she didn't realize was that every word she spoke only reinforced the sentence that was already written. One night, Sophie ran to me, sneaking away from her mother. "Grandpa, why does Mom talk to you like that?" The question hit me like a punch. I looked into those innocent eyes and simply said, "One day, you'll understand, sweetheart." And deep inside, I swore that one day wouldn't take long. Weeks went by. The invitations to parties kept arriving, each one more extravagant than the last, each one filled with people who barely even looked at me. I went anyway, always in simple clothes, always in silence. Emily mocked me between the lines, and David's eyes carried that same smug superiority, but I no longer cared. I had something they didn't, the letter hidden beneath the floorboards, the power of choice. Every time I held that old workshop sign in my hands, I remembered who I was. The boy who started with nothing. The man who fed his family with calloused hands and sleepless nights. The father who never measured the cost of sacrifice. And now, the grandfather who had chosen to leave behind the greatest legacy of all, not a car, not a house, but the honor of a name. While they clinked glasses, I was sharpening in silence the blade that would cut through the charade. And when the time came, no laughter would be strong enough to drown out the sound of my voice. Christmas arrived, heavy, as always. Emily's mansion looked like the cover of a magazine. Red and gold garlands hanging from the doors, the scent of cinnamon and mulled wine filling the air, and the garden glowing with lights that blinked in perfect synchronization. It was a performance calculated, curated, staged, just like everything in Emily and David's life. I arrived early, as usual, carrying a small box wrapped with a plain ribbon. Inside was a wooden puzzle I had carved piece by piece for Jacob and Sophie. It wasn't just a toy, it was a memory of what endures. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the stares. Some neighbors gave me rushed nods. Others avoided me altogether, too busy with their shallow conversations. Emily, flawless in a red dress, walked over with a forced smile. "Dad, I'm glad you came," she said, her voice cold, rehearsed, like she was checking off a box. David followed right behind her, glass in hand, his tie perfectly aligned. "George, make yourself at home. This is your house too, at least for now." The quiet laughter of his friends cut like daggers. I smiled in silence. They had no idea what was about to happen. As the night went on, everyone gathered in the grand living room. The fireplace crackled, filling the air with warmth that couldn't thaw the chill in my chest. Emily stood at the center, surrounded by guests, the children by her sideboard, restless, tired of listening to speeches that weren't meant for them. Then came the knock at the door. A firm, deliberate knock. Jacob ran to open it. And there he was, Attorney Harris, leather briefcase in hand. His presence clashed with the glitter of the party. He looked out of place, just as I always had in that house. But this time, the difference was that he didn't come alone. He carried with him the truth no one expected. "Dad, what is this supposed to mean?" Emily asked, her irritation slipping through the cracks of her smile. "You brought a lawyer to Christmas dinner?" The guests exchanged glances, whispering. David tugged at his jacket, trying to maintain composure. This must be some kind of mistake. Harris cleared his throat, firm and calm. "No, Mr. Anderson, this is no mistake. Mr. George Miller asked me to be here tonight to formally read his will." The room fell into a sepulchral silence. The laughter vanished. Glasses froze mid-air. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to disappear. Emily's eyes widened. "A will? Here? Now?" I looked at her, finally raising my voice after years of being silenced. "Yes, Emily, today. In front of everyone." Her face twisted, and beneath the layers of makeup, I could see the fury bubbling, but there was no turning back. The stage she had always used against me was about to become the stage where she heard her sentence. Harris opened the briefcase slowly, like a man drawing a sword. Papers slid onto the table, catching the glow of the firelight. As requested by Mr. Miller, he began, voice clear. The will was recently revised and updated. Guests held their breath. Some leaned in, curious. Others tried to slip away discreetly, but none could resist listening. I saw Jacob and Sophie glance at each other, their small hands clasping tighter. Their hearts raced. I could feel it, even across the room. Emily tried to stop it. "This is ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense," David's voice thundered. "George, what the hell is this? If you wanted attention, you could have chosen another time." I drew in a deep breath. "You both had every chance to listen to me. You never did. So now, you'll listen, even if it has to come from my lawyer's mouth." The murmurs swelled, but Harris lifted a hand for silence. "The document is legitimate. It has been registered and notarized." And in front of everyone, he began to read. At that moment, I didn't need to say another word. The words had already been written. And as he read each line, I watched Emily's face transform from disdain to shock, from shock to disbelief, from disbelief to fear. It was the first time in years that I saw her lose control. Harris's voice echoed through the room like distant thunder, each syllable cutting the air. "I hereby declare by my will that my daughter Emily Anderson shall be excluded from the inheritance. The Miller name will not follow her. All assets and legacy will pass on to Jacob and Sophie Miller." A dead silence spread across the room. A champagne glass slipped from a guest's hand and shattered on the floor, but no one moved. Even the flames of the fireplace seemed to falter, as if they too knew they bore witness to something irreversible. Emily turned pale. Her red lipstick only sharpened the sudden whiteness of her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted desperately, searching for an ally, for anyone's gaze. She found none. "This is absurd," she screamed, her voice trembling, cracking. "Dad, you can't do this to me." David stepped forward, his face red with anger. "George, this won't hold. You can't disinherit your own daughter like this." Harris raised the papers with deliberate calm, like a man lifting a verdict. "Everything is within the law. Mr. Miller was clear about his reasons, and the decision is fully recorded. Nothing can be contested." The whispers rose. Some looked at me with astonishment, others at Emily with judgment. Faces that once smiled at her now turned away, as if suddenly seeing who she really was. That was when I decided to speak. I walked to the center of the room. The heat of the fireplace pressed against my back. Every eye in the room was on me. I took a breath, looked straight at Emily, and said with a voice firm, sharp, and uncheckable, "Whoever denies their own name denies their own inheritance." The words fell like a hammer. No one dared speak. The crackling of the fire was the only sound left. Emily raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes glassy not with sorrow, but with rage. David tried whispering something in her ear, but she pushed him away, drowning in her own despair. Then Jacob stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, as if he understood more than he should at his age. He took my hand and said, in a voice small but loud enough for all to hear, "Grandpa, I'm a Miller." And Sophie ran to me, wrapping her little arms around my legs. "Me too, Grandpa." The guests whispered among themselves, some even nodding with respect. For the first time in years, I saw eyes of admiration directed at me inside that house. Eyes that before had only shown pity or indifference. Emily collapsed to her knees, the glass still in her trembling hand. "Dad, how could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I looked at her without hatred, only with the serenity that comes from decades of silence. "How could you, Emily?" I replied. "How could you silence me in front of my grandchildren? How could you rip our name away as if it were trash?" She didn't answer. There was no answer. David, desperate to regain control, raised his voice again. "This is a mistake. You can't erase a daughter from her own family's story." I looked straight at him, with a half-smile that carried pain but no apology. "History, David, writes itself. Emily erased her own name the day she chose to be ashamed of it. I simply recorded what she had already done." Once again silence, a silence so heavy it filled every corner of the room. It was in that moment that I finally felt dignity return to the space that had been stolen from me for so many years. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to rage. One sentence was enough, and within that sentence lived the weight of a lifetime. After those words left my mouth, the house was never the same. There was no applause, no celebration. There was silence, a silence heavier than any scream. Emily remained on her knees, her red dress spread across the marble floor like a living stain. Her lipstick was smudged, her eyes glistening, but not from real sorrow. It was the despair of someone watching their mask fall apart in front of the very audience they had fought so hard to impress. David tried to compose himself, but sweat streamed down his forehead. His perfect posture no longer convinced anyone. The knot of his tie seemed to strangle him, as if every word from the lawyer's mouth tightened the rope around his neck. The guests, once accomplices in laughter and toasts, now kept their distance. Some whispered, others avoided looking at Emily, as if they had suddenly realized the brilliance they once admired was nothing but a facade. One neighbor, who had always fawned over her, stepped toward me with a hushed, almost reverent voice. "Mr. Miller, I had no idea." I simply looked back at her, saying nothing, because deep down she knew. They all knew. They just never had the courage to face it. Jacob and Sophie were still beside me. The boy held tightly to my hand, as if afraid I might vanish. Sophie leaned her head against my leg, silent, but with eyes filled with pride. For the first time, I felt my grandchildren saw me for who I really was, not for who their mother said I was. Emily rose to her feet with difficulty. Her makeup was smeared, her forced smile gone. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "Dad, I didn't mean it?" I cut her off, locking my eyes on hers. "Every word you spoke was chosen. Every humiliation in front of my grandchildren was deliberate. You wanted to silence me, Emily, and you did. But you forgot one thing silence also speaks. And tonight, it spoke louder than you ever imagined." She swallowed hard. Tears rolled down, but I didn't see remorse, only the pain of losing what she thought was her birthright. David tried to intervene again, gesturing toward the guests. "This is nothing but the theater of a bitter old man. This document can be contested." Harris stepped forward, unshaken. "The document is legal and incontestable. It was filed with all proper formalities. Mr. Miller did not act out of resentment, but with full clarity and conscious choice." The lawyer's words fell like the closing of a door, final. Emily collapsed into a chair, drained of strength. Some guests approached her with half-hearted pats on the shoulder, but their gestures were cold, mechanical. The artificial respect that once surrounded her had evaporated. And me? I stood firm, not victorious, but resolute. Because the truth is, there was no joy in cutting a daughter from my will. There was only justice. Inside me was a mix of relief and pain. Relief at regaining my dignity. Pain at knowing my own daughter had forced me to this point. "Dad," she murmured, her voice almost gone. "Why did you do this to me?" I took a deep breath, looked at Jacob and Sophie, then back at her. "I didn't do this to you, Emily. You did it to yourself. I simply put it in writing." The people around us nodded silently. The social proof was their neighbors, friends, all bearing witness not just to my decision, but to the weight of her actions. In that moment, I understood something powerful. Status can be bought, rented, flaunted, but respect cannot be forged. Emily had lost the very thing she valued most in front of everyone. And I, who had been belittled so many times, was now seeing with reverence. Not because I raised my voice, but because I waited for the right moment to let her fall into the very pit she had dug for herself. Jacob looked up at me with a seriousness far beyond his years and whispered, "Grandpa, I promise I'll never forget what happened today." I smiled, running my hand through his hair. "That's all I want, my boy, that you never forget who you are." Sophie clung tighter to my legs, as if she understood. And then I knew, no matter how many lavish parties were still to be held in that house, the Miller name already had its future, not in Emily, but in the clear, untainted eyes of my grandchildren. That night, as Emily's mansion finally quieted and the guests began to leave, I stood near the fireplace, watching the flames consume the logs. The heat pressed against my face, but inside me there was only cold, not a physical cold, but the cold of realization I had done what needed to be done. And that choice didn't bring me joy, it brought me peace. Emily walked upstairs with heavy steps, never looking back. David followed, but even he seemed smaller now, as though the weight of the night had shrunk his arrogance. Only the echoes of old laughter remained now, replaced by whispers of disapproval slipping out the piano mouth. Front door along with the guests. Jacob and Sophie stayed with me. They sat on the rug near the Christmas tree, staring at the presents no one seemed eager to open anymore. Sophie was the first to speak. "Grandpa, why was Mommy crying?" I looked at her and sighed. "Because sometimes, Sophie, we only understand the value of things once we've lost them." Jacob tilted his head. "And what did she lose?" I pulled them both into my arms. "She lost the chance to honor her own name." They stayed quiet, but I could tell they understood more than they said. At that moment, I realized the true inheritance wasn't in the papers Harris had read, nor in the clauses stamped and filed. The true inheritance was right there before me, in the eyes of those two children. Emily could have chosen differently. She could have used her status to lift up her family, instead of burying our roots. But she made her choice, and every choice has a price. As for me, I finally understood that I wouldn't leave behind money, houses, or cars. I would leave something greater, the weight of a name and the strength of dignity. That night, before leaving, I walked over to the Christmas tree. I picked up the small wooden box where I kept the old workshop plaque and placed it beneath the tree among the presents. "This is for you," I told Jacob and Sophie. "Keep it safe. It's the story of our family." They smiled, curious, but I knew that with time they would understand the true value of that worn piece of wood. I left the mansion in silence. The cold night air brushed against my face, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of humiliation on my shoulders. I felt light. I felt that somehow I had restored to our name the respect it deserved. As I walked down the empty street in Charleston, lit only by the Christmas lights of the neighboring houses, I thought, I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to strike back. All it took was standing tall at the right moment. And in that moment, I understood. The greatest gift a father can leave behind is not wealth nor comfort. It's the certainty that dignity is never for sale. I closed my eyes, drew in a deep breath, and gave thanks in silence. Because that Christmas, I didn't gain forgiveness nor reconciliation, but I gained something greater, the guarantee that my name would live on the lips of those who truly deserve to carry it. If this story spoke to you, share it below. Have you ever been humiliated by your own family? I want to hear your voice. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every time we share stories like this, we prove together that no humiliation is ever strong enough to silence a heart that carries dignity.